Oh, you're on mute, Ginny.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. We're about to start. We'll just give people 1 more minute to join and then we'll kick off. If you can make sure your microphones are off, that would be fantastic. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this AIMOS Aus-RN webinar. My name is Jenny Byrne. I am one of the Aus-RN steering group. I'm really delighted to be doing this webinar today. I would just like to acknowledge that I live in beautiful Meanjin in Brisbane, on the lands of the Turrbal and Niagara people. Respect to elders past and present, acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today, and to acknowledge the work that the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people do in the research and science ecosystem that we live in. As usual, if you could please keep your microphones off, that would be great. We're doing this as a meeting. You are very welcome to type questions into the chat and we will pick them up at the end. We'll do both talks and then go to questions after that. We are recording this, as I hope you've noted, so just please be mindful of that in what you say, and if you don't want your picture on the screen, then please turn your cameras off. So I'm just going to let you know a little bit about Aus-RN. Give me a moment. Okay, so Aus-RN, which I hope that some of you might have heard of, is the Australian Reproducibility Network. We are a state-led consortium. We advocate and educate on the importance of sound reproducible science, and we're part of a global group of reproducibility networks from around the world, some of whom are enormously active, but all of whom have a shared purpose in what we do. We are multidisciplinary, and although we have had originally a focus on the biomedical sciences. So we have a large steering group which is coordinating this. Paul Glasziou, I'd particularly like to talk about him. He was one of the first people that got Aus-RN off the ground, and has been a real driver behind making it go forward. So I'm going to hand over now to Jen Beaudry, who will talk about AIMOS, which is the co-sponsor of this webinar.
Great, thanks, Ginny. So I'm Dr. Jen Beaudry. I'm the current president of the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science, or AIMOS. The purpose of AIMOS is to bring together researchers who are committed to making the research process more trustworthy and more efficient, as well as to promote the study of how research is done and how it can be improved. We are an interdisciplinary society, and we welcome the views of researchers from all fields and backgrounds. We are also an international society with members from around the globe, but we are focusing our efforts on building this open science and meta-research community within Australasia, so that you don't have to travel to the Northern Hemisphere to connect with like-minded colleagues. So after Jenny and Ben speak, I'll give you the details of our conference that we're holding in Sydney this November. And I'll hand back to Jenny now so she can introduce today's speakers. Oh, and you're on mute, Jenny.
Remembered by now. Anyway, thank you, Jennifer. All right, so let me introduce our speakers. We have two incredibly distinguished speakers today, and I'm just really delighted by the interest we have in this this topic. It shows to me, I think, that this is clearly importance to people across the region. So I'm going to introduce them both, but Jenny will speak first. So Jennifer Byrne is Director of Biobanking at New South Wales Health and Professor of Molecular Oncology at the University of Sydney, where she leads the PRIMA group, the Publication and Research Integrity in Medical Research. Jennifer was one of Nature's 10 people in 2017 for highlighting repetitive human gene research papers with critical reagent errors. She was one of 3 experts who testified before the US Congress in 2022 at their congressional hearing into paper mills and research misconduct. Jennifer's research team has continued to identify features of flawed human gene and cancer research, including descriptions of human cell lines that may not exist. So Ben Mol is Professor of Obstetrics and Gynaecology at Monash University. He concentrates on the organisation of multicentric evaluative research in obstetrics, gynaecology and fertility. His research mainly focuses on everyday practices. He was born and trained in the Netherlands and instrumental there in setting up a nationwide research consortium on women's health that produced many landmark studies. Ben came to Australia in 2014 and works as Professor of Obstetrics and Gynaecology at Monash, where he's been since 2018. In the Australians 2025 research rankings, Ben was acknowledged as Australia's and the world's leading research in reproductive health. So we're incredibly lucky to have both of them here speaking to us today. I will hand over to Jenny and then Ben after that. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you very much, Ginny. I'll share my screen. Here we go. I think you can see that. I'll just put that into presentation mode and we'll start. I should add that I'm joining you today from the land of the Gadigal people in Sydney, the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my title is a nod to the name of our research team, which is the Primer Group, as Ginny mentioned, and we are supported by funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council and also by the University of Sydney. I wanted to also acknowledge that I am the David Vo Research Integrity Fellow for 2025 and 2026. So this fellowship award was established to honour Professor David Vo, who championed scientific research integrity in Australia, as many people here will be aware. And this award was established through a generous donation from the Weehai Institute through Dr. Glenn Begley and Mrs. Maren Begley. And so David Vo was the first recipient of this award and I'm the second recipient. So I'll be giving you a background today on paper mills and why some research fields might be vulnerable to exploitation by paper mills. We'll talk a bit about some of the responses that are being taken, but perhaps most importantly, how researchers and people within their research ecosystem can protect themselves from these kinds of publications. If you're interested in scientific publishing, I quite enjoyed this paper that was published in PLOS Biology a couple of years ago by Richard Sever. It gives a broad overview of biomedical publishing in terms of what's happened in the past and what might happen in the future. And one of the things that this article talked about was the change in publishing that's happened over the past 30 years from where we were in the 1990s, certainly predominantly publishing a course to a closed or subscription access model. But this has recently changed where now we are publishing similar numbers of papers through an open access model. And the main increase in these numbers of publications is through what's called gold open access publishing, which is where the author pays an article processing charge. So this slide just compares open access and subscription publishing. Of course, both models have their strengths and weaknesses. Subscription publishing focuses on readers or institutions, and a subscription is required to access this content. Publishing more tends to cost more. So for this reason, the subscription model has historically focused upon sort of scarcity and quality. So the gold open access model is quite different. Subscriptions are obviously not required. The author becomes the focus because this is the entity that is paying the article processing charge. Clearly, publishing more pays more, and this has led to an inadvertent focus on quantity as opposed to quality in some sectors. There's always been different ways of valuing papers, and the primary way that we should be looking at publications is obviously their research value to society. To a commercial publisher, however, of course, publications do have some commercial value, and publications also have career value for their authors. So these different ways of valuing publications, this tension can be managed, in my view, as long as research value is what trumps all other types of value. So papers have commercial or career value because of their research value. And if this value is forgotten or lost, publications can be reduced to commercial or career tokens. And this is the kind of territory that research paper mills step in and occupy. So we have defined paper mills as entities that sell undeclared research publishing services. This undeclared nature of these services is very important. There is nothing wrong with using publishing services as long as they're declared. So paper mills trade in genuine, falsified, or probably predominantly fabricated data sets, entire manuscripts. They can sell author positions on manuscripts. They can take care of manuscript submission for authors. They will take care of editorial handling if you let them, peer review if you let them, post-publication commentary, and there's increasing evidence that paper mills sell citations to their own products. This is an advertisement that was passed to me several years ago by colleagues in the States, and these types of advertisements are very, very easy to find. In this case, we have 3 papers with their titles indicated, and this is using the author slot model of selling papers. You can see that the middle paper only, basically the first author position is not available, presumably because that's been sold. So there are 4 main components to the research paper mill ecosystem. Obviously, the mills themselves that are on the inside of this ecosystem. Mills rely upon people who need papers. So these people give their identities as authors and money. The mill will produce a manuscript, and then that goes to journals, which may be inside or outside of that ecosystem. The manuscripts provides funds, future citations to the journals. The publications provide, prestige metrics to the institutions. The institutions then turn this wheel by placing pressure on people to publish through, for example, quotas or incentives such as career rewards or even financial rewards. So this wheel is really turned by everybody within the ecosystem. And in all cases, we have no reference to the scientific value of the publications. They have commercial value to the publisher, career value to the author. So some of the early signs of paper mills started to emerge about 12 years ago. Paper mills were first discussed in the literature in around 2013. Around this time, John Ioannidis noticed a very sharp increase in the number of meta-analyses that were being published. It was also noted that peer review was being actively manipulated in some quarters, and that was probably an early sign of paper mills. Elizabeth Bick published her paper on image duplications in 2016, and this was probably also a sign of paper mills at work in part. And then we published a paper in early 2017 where we identified very similar gene research papers with implausible errors and specifically proposed that paper mills might be the source of at least some of these papers. So why might some forms of research be vulnerable to paper mills? I essentially think about research in 2 ways. There's research that's intrinsically resistant to fraud, and that is where the effort of fabricating research is about the same as doing the real thing. But research becomes vulnerable to fraud when fabrication becomes much easier than genuine research. So how does that happen? Well, in experimental sciences, a lot of research is difficult, it's expensive, or it's slow. And this is where research becomes vulnerable to fraud. In the most extreme case, when research is all of these things, difficult, expensive, and slow, it's obviously much easier to fake it. So this slide shows, why this is the case. So in the kind of research that I used to do, it was not unusual for us to spend 5 to 10 years publishing something, because individual stage of the research process could take years alone. Just doing experiments can take years. Clearly, if you're a paper mill, you don't have to do any experiments. So you start here writing a very quick manuscript and you enter the peer review system. So they're really at a very extreme advantage. Gene research offers specific scaling and dilution factors that probably operate in many other fields as well. So we have many topics through the existence of 40,000 human genes, just to begin with, that can be written about in different ways. Different kinds of authors can publish these papers. Many, many journals will publish basic gene research papers, and this can all go on for a long time if it's not detected or if we choose not to act once we know that it's going on. I think something that people don't talk about enough is the issue of journal oversupply. I think in cancer research and gene research, this really enables paper mills. Again, research just simply cannot be scaled to supply all of the journals that can be very easily created. And it's also extremely difficult to scale and sustain quality operations at journals through limitations in editors, peer reviewers, and of course, quality manuscripts. In the last couple of years, we've been thinking about how generative AI could further turbocharge this problem by potentially converting fields that were previously resistant to fraud to enable scaled fabrication of new areas of vulnerable research. So I actually made this slide in 2023. This is when we started really thinking about this. And just this year, we've started to see, well, actually, in the last couple of years, we've started to see examples of where this might be happening. So Suchak et al. Published a paper about a month ago in PLOS Biology where they described an explosive increase in the number of papers that were describing single-factor analyses of the NHANES health data set in the US. And this is to be compared, so the rate of increase in these manuscripts is obviously very marked from 2023 and 2024. This is compared with a control keyword such as Biobank. And in 2024, Stender et al. Had described a very similar phenomenon, seeing a very sharp rise in increase in the number of papers that talk about Mendelian randomization. So what might be happening? Essentially, we have an increased emphasis on making health data sets open access so that they can be used. And increasingly, these data sets come with either dedicated APIs for data analysis or very simply implemented R scripts. So people can analyze the data, possibly dredge the data to look for statistically significant associations, and then plug this data into a large language model to produce a manuscript. So some journals are now reporting being overwhelmed by these kinds of manuscripts. So what kind of responses are being taken? I'm just going to talk about a few of these. And some of you actually will already be subject to some of these responses through, for example, more stringent manuscript screening and handling processes that you may not even realize that you're being subjected to. Since about 2020, the Chinese Academy of Sciences has been publishing early warning lists. So this was the only warning list in 2024 with a couple of quite well-known journals highlighted. And some of these journals were listed because of paper mill activity or other surrogate descriptors that could also be consistent with paper mills. It's being increasingly recognised that special issues within journals can provide a gateway for paper mills by providing an opportunity for a mill-associated editor to be appointed who will then take care of manuscript submission and peer review. This came to the fore, I think, in 2023 and 2024 when the Hindawi publisher retracted around 12,000 articles, largely for compromised peer review in association with paper mills. And the Hindawi brand, I think, is being sunsetted, as the term is, by the Wiley publisher that published them. Sorry, that purchased Hindawi. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about assessing papers and how we can look out for the signs of, I guess, problematic research and potential paper mill involvement. These things all seem very, very obvious, but good quality, genuine research tends to talk about interesting topics with specific and well-justified questions. They use well-designed methods. The results align with the question and the methods. The discussion actually addresses the results, recognises limitations, and the paper is supported by well-chosen and meaningful references. So you might think, well, aren't all papers like this? Well, that's not true. Unfortunately, the kinds of papers that we study fall in the right-hand category, where a lot of the time the topics are really not very interesting, at least to an expert. Research questions are often very superficial or novelty-based. Of course, if you're not actually doing experiments, you can afford to use superfluous methods and produce large bodies of results that only tangentially inform the research question, and so on. So these can be signs of papers to avoid. Of course, everybody is interested in shortcuts. This is a slide that I predominantly show to students, but I think it's a good idea to show it here. You know, everyone would like to think, well, what's the sign of a quality journal? Can we judge a journal by its impact factor? I would say absolutely not, because of course impact factors and citations measure popularity and can be very easily gamed. Reputable publishers, people can look at publishers, but the reality is the majority of the literature is published by very large publishers that publish many journals, up to thousands of journals that are of variable quantity. And open access, of course, can be a good thing in terms of access, but it can lead to this focus upon quantity at the expense of quality. So paper mills obviously operate at scale. So when we think about whether or not papers might come from a mill, it's important to put papers into context. So signs of paper mills can be unexpected patterns in the literature, unusual numbers, concentrations of highly similar papers, papers from one country when there is no good scientific reason for that country to be investing so heavily in one area of research. Where you see similar papers that are authored by the same people, that can be a sign of salami slicing, so deliberately dividing large studies into smaller units so that to generate more papers. But where the authors are different, this can be a sign of manuscripts being sold through paper mills. So an example of these are the first papers that we actually studied. So we had 5 papers studying the same gene, looking at the same cellular process, but looking at different cancer types as the variation. So just to finalize, I think we can all, make better choices in terms of protecting ourselves against these kinds of problems. Think carefully about what you read, what you cite, for whom you review, where you publish. Look out for journals that are publishing lots of similar papers that have very rapidly rising publication numbers, that seem to have nice impact factors and that seem to be quite easy to publish in. Really advise you all to download the PubPeer plugin. This is a way of flagging post-publication commentary on individual papers. You can subscribe to Retraction Watch, and Nature and Science are very actively talking about these kinds of issues. We published this paper about 5 years ago. It's quite a simple introduction to paper mills. It's freely available. And with Adrian Barnett, we also talked about the literature as an unsafe workplace and the consequences of journals and publishers failing to correct the literature at scale. So I'd like to thank my team. These are my team in Sydney and my many collaborators. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was fantastic. It's an alarming kind of trip through what's out there, but I think your tips are fantastic. So we'll hold questions until the end. Ben, over to you now, and we'll come back to questions at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, for this kind of oversight and for the invitation. It's very good, I think, to see such a big audience interested in this topic. So my title is Evidence-Based Medicine 2025. We have the data, but are they true? My conflicts of interest, I show them, but they're, I don't think, relevant for this talk. And I take you to the field where I work, women's health, and then guidelines. So these are guidelines on unexplained infertility that were made by NICE and ESHRE. And last year, we were in the process of converting that to Australian guidelines. And then we noticed a paper of Cassini. And more in detail, it turned out that the p-values of that paper were not reproducible. So the claim of significance was not there. And then looking further in the work of that author, because I do that as a routine, it turned out that Dr. Cassini had published 2 other randomized clinical trials in fertility sterility, one of the major journals in my field, on a similar topic. And if you looked more careful to the 2 baseline tables of that paper, then they were similar. So these are 2 baseline tables from different RCTs, different interventions, different patient numbers, and still you can see that all the baseline characteristics are exactly the same. So the second paper has been retracted, the first paper not. And even that is problematic because you can also see that the combination of age, duration of menopause, and year of menopause do not fit together. So this material comes in guidelines that informs clinical practice around the world, and that is my concern. So I will try to estimate how big that problem is, see what the implications are for our practice, talk a little bit about detection, and then say what we can do. So if we talk about fabrication, I think it's important to realize that we're not talking about unintentional error, and even not on things like undeserved authorship or guest authorship or plagiarism, but we talk about making up the data by fabrication or falsification, which is really almost the worst type of misconduct that you can imagine. And my position is that I got this from one of my former bosses when we had some kind of conflict, and he learned me there is the importance of the outcome and there is the importance of the relationship, and if you discuss, you should see where you are. Well, I'm going to declare here that the importance of the outcome of this topic is very high for me. So I'm happy to collaborate and to discuss and negotiate, but if I have to, I'm going to fight, and I'm not going to kind of give in on this topic. So how big is this problem? You can try to estimate that from the number of retractions, but as Jenny already pointed out, retraction is something that is happening very slowly and difficult. So this is not the best measure. Retractions are increasing. This is a report of Richard van Noorden, who reported that in 2023, the number of retractions for the first time reached 10,000. Better sources, I think, looking to editors or topics. John Carlisle is an editor of the journal Anesthesiology, who is long already checking the papers that come to his journal. And he reported that from 500 RCTs on the first glance, looking at the tables, he thinks that about 15% have false data. And if you go more in depth and you ask for raw data, then that increases to 40%. And John Ioannidis, when he read that, wrote an editorial and said, well, if that is true, then, and that would be true for other fields also, then we have hundreds of thousands of zombie RCTs in medicine. So back to my own field, obstetrics gynecology. This is a Cochrane review that synthesizes all the evidence on progesterone to prevent preterm birth, very frequently used treatment. And you can see from the estimates here that the relative risk, whether you look at pregnancy outcomes or neonatal outcomes, is about 0.5. So there's about a 0.5, 50% reduction of preterm birth from progesterone. But a group of authors led by Leslie Cowan did an individual participant data meta-analysis, so a meta-analysis with the raw data, and she got 32 of the 49 papers, and the other 17 authors did not share data. So Europe did good, 9 out of 10. The US did good, 14 out of 15. Australia did best, 1 out of 100%. But the problem here came from studies from the Middle East, 3 out of 10, and Egypt, only 1 out of 6 that shared data. And what happens then is that the estimate of the treatment effect from the authors that share data it's still there, but it's much less strong, not 50%, but 20% reduction. Other topics, this is an IPD I did myself on endometrial injury prior to IVF. That's thought to increase the pregnancy rate. And when we did an IPD from, again, let me see where the numbers are. We had 37 papers that thought could share data, and only 12 did so. And when we got those data, 2 out of the 12 actually had problematic data. And from the people that did not share data, that was again Iran, Egypt, China, and a number of other countries. So this is an overview of a series of IPDs that me and my team have done. So the first 2 I showed you. I'll not go through all the numbers, but the main message is that from 300 RCTs that we identified and we approached authors for data, at 200 we didn't get the data, and from the 100 that we evaluated, just over 12 were problematic. And then you should think really about authors who copy whole strings of data in their data set. So you can see here that birth weight is just repeatedly copied in the data set. And this particular study had all kinds of patients double in the data set. That was also here. And the fabricator of the month was somebody who sent us a data set with a random generator in it for the variable BMI. So you can say that happens and how bad it is. I mean, the other concern is, and this is work from Chen Feng, just published in Human Reproduction Open, that a large majority of the RCTs informing our practice comes from countries like China, Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and India. Sensitive thing to say, but out of 1,400 infertility RCTs, 66% comes from these countries. China, Iran, and Egypt make up 50% of the RCTs. And within Europe, Italy, don't know if you'd be happy with that, is the leading country. So if we would be in a room now, I would be silent and say, do you think we have a problem? But I think we have a problem. And based on what I showed, my estimate is that 30% of the RCTs that inform our meta-analysis and guidelines are fabricated or at least untrustworthy. So the consequences, meta-analysis go wrong. These are 2 examples of retracted meta-analysis. because the editor thought, or the author thought, that the data were not reliable anymore. And one of the consequences or the causes of that was that it took actually very long to retract the original papers. This is how we in my group do meta-analysis nowadays. So we don't add up all the data, but we assess for trustworthiness through screening of IPD or assessing the papers. And this is an example where the overall conclusion is different from the conclusion of what we think are the reliable data. Helena T does a lot of work on PCOS, led globally the PCOS guidelines. We together assessed the RCTs that informed these guidelines, and as compared to the previous version, we lost 45% of the RCTs in a very solid process. Last example, this is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, their guideline from 10 years ago. Subclinical hypothyroidism, if you see that, treat it. And the recent guideline says you shouldn't do that. And the reason is they have removed one RCT that they consider not to be reliable. So I'm not going to go through all the examples based on time, but what I've just showed is that there is an enormous amount of misinformed guidelines also. Yeah, I think it is completely unacceptable, and I'm actually surprised by the silence and the lack of response. Reasons for that: first, patient safety, but also the confidence that society should have in science, public trust in science, our colleagues who do the right thing, country's reputation, all arguments to deal with this problem. British Medical Journal, very recent, looked at a group of authors, including Paul Glacio, his name was already mentioned, looked at the impact of retracted papers on guidelines and concluded that each retracted paper is used in about 1 to 3 meta-analysis, and also said that about 10 to 20% of the conclusions of meta-analysis were wrong. My message to these authors was, well, not retracted papers is the problem, but the enormous amount of papers that are problematic and that are not retracted. So what do we do about it? We have developed a checklist. Time is not enough to go through it. It's not rocket science. It's just looking with an awareness of could these data be true, and check all kinds of logistic checks and biological checks. You can also look at the statistics of papers. This is an example of RCTs from Suez Canal University, and Lyle Gurn is working on this topic together with me, where we assessed all RCTs from that institute. The baseline characteristics of these RCTs have in about 25% a p-value that is statistical significant or highly statistical significant. So that in itself proves that these studies, or at least part of them, are not randomized. We've written to editors and publishers. That's a painful process. We published this in the British Journal of ONG earlier this year. We wrote to about 900 different papers. There are 2 messages from this exercise. One is that if there comes a result from the investigation, we're mostly right. So there's usually a retraction or an expression of concern. But many, many papers are pending. And the time to these decisions is really incredibly long. So this Kaplan-Meier curves indicates that 12 months after flagging, only 15% of the editors or publishers has come with a result of their investigation. And that is through all journals and also through all publishers. COPE, the system that deals with this post-publication concerns, is a difficult process. Still, this is an editor, Frans Raumann, who followed the rules and retracted in the course of 2 years 18 of the 19 papers that we had flagged, and I actually disagree with the assessment of paper number 19. But there's a lot of resistance. This is two big RCTs from Turkey on the treatment of postpartum hemorrhage during labor. That is the most frequent cause of maternal mortality around the world. Very prestigious journals, American Journal of ONG and the Obstetrics and Gynaecology, the Green Journal. And again, it might go quickly, but the baseline tables are similar for two groups. And that is just not possible if you claim that these are different RCTs. So the journal said, one journal never responded. The other said, after an investigation, we have decided not to pursue any action against the author, as we do not believe there is ample evidence of misconduct. And the Cochrane review is just out. The paper is still, the two papers are still in there with an overall sample size of 3,200 patients. This is another example. This is Dr. Majed. He published on swimming for premenstrual syndrome, and then he had this figure. Well, if you look a little bit careful, then nobody is swimming here, but it's exercise. So I looked at Google Image Scanner, and I found this picture actually on a Vietnamese website long before this paper was published. And the response of the journal was, believe it or not, to remove the figure for legal reasons and leave the paper untouched otherwise out there. An example from Iran, Dr. Safariniat has, I think, 40 retractions. You can already see that there are problems with these p-values, and we recalculated them. They're all wrong. Wiley said, well, we have followed proper process, and unless you have new details, there is no reason to take action. The editor-in-chief of that journal actually has published with an Egyptian group. I asked him for his data set. They're all double patients in this study of 1,000 patients, and I flagged this 2 years ago. The paper is just still untouched online. A last example, clear copying between tables of different studies. And I have 5 examples from this particular author group. And the journal Fertility Sterility says the authors have sent us the data. They match the paper, so there is no reason to take action. So what is in general the response of editors? I really have no time for this. The journal gets 80 submissions per week. This editor who said that actually was a main fabricator himself. It exists in all specialties in every country. We work on it, be patient. And the last one, we cannot keep up with the number of complaints you send to us. My answer was, I'm sorry, I cannot complain or keep up with the number of problematic papers that you publish. Consequences for me, I am heavily investigated myself. I don't have a problem with that. If you're critical on others, you should be critical on yourself too. But at some stage, it's really harming because my Chinese and Vietnamese collaborators get really nervous of all these investigations. Complaints at my universities, they have both investigated, can't find anything. There has been complaints against my medical capacity with APRA, which is quite threatening if you work for a foreign doctor. And one colleague actually said, I'm really concerned about your mental health. There is a response. The number of RCTs from Egypt in my field is enormously going down. If you look into particular problematic authors, so everybody is aware of it, but the response is not as you would expect, I would say, in other areas of society. We all know what happened with Boeing. How many problems there were when they didn't check their safety systems. And another example is Daihatsu, where last year the factory was completely closed because there was falsification of safety reports. This is from this morning. This is the Trump administration complaining about slow retractions. So Michael Kretschus, who is the spokesperson about this topic from the Trump government, mentioned this as bad handling. And then the next thing he did was he said, and then we had COVID and COVID policy, and you can question that. And then there is the next step to COVID denial. So the important message is, if we do not clean our science, then others will use us to criticize also where the science is good. We've published or got attention from The Economist, and one of the most interesting comments came from a neonatologist who said it's really remarkable that this topic has to be addressed from outside medicine and not from inside medicine. So in summary, I think 5 to 10% of the medical literature is untrustworthy, fake. For randomized clinical trials, I think this percentage is around 30 to 40%. It's the researchers and their systems who do that. There is poor peer review and editorial publisher response. But I think a third problem, and I'm glad again with the invitation, is the silence of academic and clinical communities until now, I'm afraid to say, also in Australia. And with that, I give back to Jenny.
Thanks, Ben. That was tremendous. Scary and really important. And I think, what both Jenny's and Ben's talk show is that this extends across the entirety of research. It's preclinical, but really into clinical and guidelines. And that's, we should be really worried about that. And Ben, I take your point about the fact that this is going to be co-opted by those who don't have the best interests of science in their minds. And so it's really important that the academic community takes hold of this. I just want to thank both of you, because I know that this is really hard work that both of you do, and it just comes across in your talk how important and how rigorous the work that you yourself have done in understanding all of this. All right, so we have some time for questions. There's quite a few. We've got both in the Q&A and also in the chat, but I'm going to actually start with one that Jenny, you kindly answered in the Q&A, but I'd like to hear Ben's thoughts on it as well, which is I know that we've got a range of people in the audience today. We've got both academics and I know we have quite a few librarians here. So this is a question, I think, from a librarian who says librarians know about these issues, would love tips on how to communicate these concerns in a meaningful way. And I guess the question is, what responses do you get from academics or researchers when you speak to them about paper mills? Are they aware? Are they willing to do anything? Perhaps, Ben, I'll ask you to answer that one first.
Well, I get no reaction. Right. Nobody wants to speak out of it. I mean, I really try, and I should be. I mean, I see Lau Gurin here, and I see Nicole Au, and other people I work with. So it's not completely true. Jim Thornton is very vocal in the UK, but in general, people don't want to speak out of it. They get nervous about calling out something that is clearly fabricated because they're not 100% sure. They're afraid for the legal threats, etc., etc. But, well, I'm not going to mention any names, and then I can say this. I'm afraid also that there are many people who just don't oversee exactly the methods of clinical science and therefore are not willing to call out what is really impossible. So they don't really understand the mechanisms of randomized clinical trials, for example, and therefore, they don't see it as reviewers or editors, but also if they're confronted with it, they don't want to make the call that this cannot be true. Yeah.
Jenny, did you want to comment on the point about people looking at it in their own specialties?
Actually, I think my response to the question was, when I present, I find that the people that receive this information really well are the researchers themselves. I think researchers want to know if they're reading papers that are unreliable. But what I find concerning is just the low level of awareness that's still there. I mean, we have been talking about paper mills in the literature for more than 10 years. And yet when I would present to a group, the majority of people have never heard of this problem. Sorry, did that answer the question, Ginny?
Yes, yeah, I think it's clear that the lack of awareness is a huge challenge, and I hear that too. Maybe I'm going to pick some out of the chat, and apologies if I don't get to yours. Jenny, there's one about selling author positions on legitimate research. Somebody said, always assume that papers produced by these mills are fake. Do you have a sense of, when this happens legitimately? I think I'd be interested in knowing what your sense of the problem is there.
Yes, I think in my talk I indicated obviously it's a lot quicker and you can fake research at scale, and so genuine manuscripts that will be available for sale will be orders of magnitude fewer. But nonetheless, I think there is probably some evidence that Some authors will be willing to sell positions on their original or on their genuine papers. Some groups that might be vulnerable to that are students who are experiencing financial hardship, or even, you know, other people that see this as a good trade-off. But I would say that the majority of the papers that are coming out of mills are probably produced by the mills and are largely fabricated.
Okay, a question about, I'm going to tie this two together, one about systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but also with RCTs. Do you have a sense of how to make researchers aware of this? And how much do you think the poor search strategy impacts on the results of the data if people are not picking up those papers in the first place? I mean, I think, Ben, you've partly answered that question, but I'd like to think if you've got more thoughts on that.
So, yeah, I think it should be, and I'm talking about that with Matt Page and others. I think it should be part of the PRISMA guidelines. I mean, we all are a bit jealous of the citation index of Matt and others. Well, between brackets, I congratulate them with the success of PRISMA and other guidelines. But that is a great opportunity, actually, to make people aware of this problem. I mean, if I look at myself, I might have been a bit angry. I'm sorry for that. 10 years ago, I was not aware of this problem also. So it took 5 years for me to get aware of it. But that awareness, yeah, is one important thing to do. And guidelines for meta-analysis and checklists are excellent for this. On the other end, I think we should look at the problem a little bit higher stream upwards, where these papers come into the system. I haven't given up the hope that we can filter that out. And I'm actually very disappointed with the response from editors and publishers here, who are maybe also still unaware of this problem or the scale of it. But I think that the academic and clinical communities should put pressure on these systems to improve. I mean, the examples that I showed are just a few out of almost hundreds I have. And I make the comparison with maintenance reports of airplanes. I mean, if you would translate this problem to Qantas, and you would say Qantas is faking 40% of their maintenance reports, yet they wouldn't fly tonight, right? And the CEO would be fired overnight. So how can we, for medicine, then kind of sit back and accept that papers are investigated for years, where everybody can see that there's a problem? That is something that I think we as a community should go to the publishers mainly and say, what you do here is just unacceptable.
Thanks. As a journal editor, I would just say I'm acutely aware of this, but I know that that's not the case for everyone. I'm going to put two questions together about what potential remedies or what there might be. So,
well,
sorry, one is...
Can I respond on that? I mean, what you could do as the Medical Journal of Australia, you could actually go to the Lancet and BMJ and JAMA and New England and say, this is unacceptable. I think how the Lancet handles Elsevier is, for me, unacceptable. So there should really be pressure on the leadership of the Lancet. Say, if you continue to be the flagship of Elsevier, you better talk to Elsevier to raise their standard. Not so much towards what they publish in the Lancet, but elsewhere. Elsevier is a nightmare.
These publishers are kind of monster organizations. Now, I agree with that. Okay. So look, we don't think there are sanctions on individuals for this. I mean, Jenny, your point about the paper mills, these are businesses, aren't they? And I suspect it's pretty rare for anyone to get sanctioned for this. So do we need to have a research integrity body in Australia? I mean, will that help, or what other sanctions can we try and apply other than individual?
I mean, I think we need a research integrity body for sort of other issues, but I would definitely support that. I think this came home to me when during the peer review of one of our papers, and one of the peer reviewers made comments about countries that don't have national integrity bodies, referring to other countries. And I wrote back to the peer review as part of my response and said, well, that's Australia. You know, so we're not in a very good group by not having a national integrity body.
What about sanctions on any individuals? Have you seen that work anywhere? Or in individual organisations, the type of have any of these paper mills come to the fore and actually been prosecuted?
I'm not aware of that. Look, I must say I don't sort of study that side of it too much. I think one of the things about paper mills is they're really shape-shifting organisations. They're largely digital. They can change their names, their locations, what they do very, very easily, and they have models that are likely specifically designed to be very difficult to track down. I mean, we've proposed that a little bit in line with what Ben is talking about, in terms of airline safety, that we need to start thinking about the literature as a workplace that's an unsafe workplace for researchers. And I think a lot of this, at the moment, some of the incentives that are operating in the publishing system could be removed by, or at least reduced by having an accreditation system for journals, where journals are externally accredited according to their standards in publishing, but also post-publication correction. I think that would be a game changer. That could be very easily done.
I'm aware of one group of authors that has been, according to social media, fired from the university in Mansoura, but as far as I know now, they're working again. I think the more important response is not so much about punishing, I would say, it's also about giving people a way out and say we should not use these papers anymore, rather than kind of going after people and convicting them. So my priority is to get these papers out of the system informing clinical practice. And you should actually maybe be a bit mild for the authors and say, it all has all passed peer review also, and you should have seen it that way. So it's more a failure of the system, so to say, rather than the wrongdoing of authors. And another thing where I think is a great opportunity is just to investigate one author at once if they have done 4 or 5 problematic papers. But there is no such system in place. So every editor and every publisher starts from scratch and says, no, we're going to just assess the next paper. Well, in terms of safety, that's a crazy attitude, obviously.
I think that feeds into, there's a comment here about the American Society of Equality saying that organisations spend 10 to 15% of their operating costs on quality-related costs. That's, Ben, that's your point about how airlines function. How do we get that kind of level of investment? We have obviously nowhere clearly close to that kind of level of investment or interest in that. This is a role for funders? Who should we be talking to really make the issue of quality front and centre?
In Australia, you mean?
Yeah.
For me, maybe I'm controversial, but for me, the problem is not there. The problem is elsewhere. So I'm pretty happy with. There's always room for improvement, but I'm pretty happy actually with kind of the integrity and the trustworthiness from research in areas of the world where there is good governance. So I don't think that the investment is needed there.
I mean, we've argued for the need. We view paper mills as really, it's an international emergency in publishing. And if we look at what happened, during the COVID pandemic, we, rightly so had, resources diverted to COVID. We had new resources for COVID. We really need both of those things happening now, because one of the issues that we have is we don't even really understand the problem that we're facing. So we've written an article, I'll pop it into the chat, talking about the need for investment into 5 key questions that would inform the problem. And I think what we're seeing this year is with, I guess we're starting to feel the impacts of generative AI. We need those investments more than ever. So funders can help make those decisions. Look, publishers are very wealthy organizations. They could contribute some of their profits towards this. We don't see that really happening at the scale that I think it needs to, given the seriousness of the problem.
I think there should be much more pressure on the publishers. I mean, if you sell fish, it should be fresh, and if you sell groceries, it should be fresh also. So if you sell science, it should be true, right? And if you don't do that, then you have a problem. But then with the profit margin of companies like Elsevier, it's really unbelievable that they don't do that. And I think the other role for regulatory bodies or governing bodies in Australia, like NHMRC, is reach out to other societies elsewhere and say that, and put pressure on there to improve things. I know that that is happening in China. China has actively now started to investigate authors with retracted papers, which you might feel unpleasant for the authors involved, but I think that is going to help. Whereas in a country like Egypt, I see no response at all. It is a complete cover-up by everyone, including the universities. Well, that there is I think, a responsibility for organizations like NHMRC, and maybe also for MGA in an international context to respond and go to these countries and say, yeah, what's happening here is really not acceptable.
Thanks, Ben. And look, I think what this all ties back into in the end is the incentive structure, which is driving this behaviour on so many different levels. And so I think that, you know, a coordinated conversation around that is just absolutely essential. All right, look, I will stop with the questions there. I know there's more coming in. Thank you so much for everyone who's been putting them in. Please hold on, because we have a couple of things to advertise to you, to tell you about what's happening in this space in Australia. So please don't go away. And but if you want to keep the questions coming or the chat discussions going, please do that. I'll hand back over to Jen just to talk about a couple of things. I'll share my screen whilst we do that.
Okay, thanks, Ginny. So in case you missed it at the beginning, I'm Jen Beaudry. I'm the president of AIMOS, the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science. And we have our 7th annual conference coming up in Sydney in November this year. And for the first time, we're partnering with the Evidence, Policy and Influence Collective from the University of Sydney. This conference immediately follows the NEURA Research Integrity Conference, which is the 17th and 18th of November in Sydney, and then will be from the 19th to the 21st. Registrations, are now open, and we'll have a call for proposals open in a few months as well. AIMOS is a different type of conference, so it's not just presentations by speakers, but it gives you a chance to workshop ideas together, to discuss issues in your fields, and to work together to solve a problem in hackathons. We have 3 plenary speakers lined up. So we have Professor Lisa Barrow from the University of Colorado, and she's a leader in evidence synthesis, meta-research, and studying commercial determinants of health. Her research focuses on tobacco control, pharmaceutical policy, and public health. We also have Ivan Oransky, who's one of the co-founders of Retraction Watch, which is the most comprehensive database of these retracted articles in academic publishing. And then we have Dr. Nicholas Charters from the University of Sydney, and he explores how corporations and industries undermine the scientific and regulatory process to create doubt about the harms of their products. So we have some new disciplines coming into AIMOS this year, which is great. It's wonderful to hear about the issues in other fields. And then I want to also just promote our next webinar, which is co-hosted by AIMOS and Aus-RN, which is exploring efforts to prevent statistical errors before publication. Dr. Michelle Nooyten from Tilburg University in the Netherlands will be speaking about her software StatCheck that you can use to prevent errors in your own work before you submit it for publication. And then Dr. Tom Hardwick from the University of Sydney will talk about the efforts being made by the editorial team at Psychological Science to catch any statistical errors in manuscripts that they're considering publishing. So this webinar will be held in August, and we're just in the process of locking in the dates now. So we'll promote this through our usual channels, so keep an eye out for those details. And I'll hand back to Jenny now. Oh, and you're on mute, Jenny.
I'm muted. Yeah, thank you, Jen. So I just want to say that one thing that we're doing at Aus-RN is we'd like to know who's working on this on Australia. So if you are interested in this, if you have been dabbling in it, if you're doing work that you'd like to let us know about, we'd really encourage you to do this survey. We will share it obviously through the usual channels, but if you'd like to take a screenshot now and tell us what you're up to, that would be great. We're keen to grow the database of people that are working on reproducibility in Australia, and to, I guess, provide a place for people to be able to discuss this kind of stuff, because I know it's hard work, and it can sometimes, I think, feel like you're ploughing a very lonely furrow, but there are people working in this area. So I will end this there. Thanks so much to Jenny and Ben for your talks. That was fantastic. Thank you for all the work that you do in this. I hope everybody enjoyed this. Please keep the conversations coming, and we will get the recording of this up on our webinar, up on our site in the near future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.